Okay, let's get going. So I'd like to welcome all to the second to last Hanover Forest Seminar for this semester. This semester is moving along here, and it's my pleasure to introduce and host Dr. Raffaella Marzano, who's from the Department of Agricultural, Forestry, and Food Sciences at the University of Torino. And her interest in forestry is focused on forest disturbances and more recently restoration ecology. And so I find it Raffaella to come and give a regular research seminar, but also I think she's going to tell us a little bit about just forests and forests in Italy, just because many of us probably don't have a good sense of what that is, what that means. So,
yep.
Okay, Raffaella, I'll turn it over to you.
So thanks a lot, David. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I hope my English is good enough for you to understand what I'm trying to explain. But if there's anything you don't understand, please raise your hand or just ask. I would like to keep this seminar really informal. So I'm open to questions all through the seminar. So as David was mentioning, I'm supposed to be some kind of an expert in forest disturbances in Alpine region in Italy. And recently, since I've been working on post-disturbance management, I've turned also to restoration ecology. So I'm teaching also restoration ecology in my classes in Italy. So as David was also mentioning, I decided to start with some background and fun facts or not so fun facts about forests in Italy, because I don't know how many of you are familiar with the context of Italian forests. And then we will move into the nitty-gritty of the fire ecology and post-disturbance dynamics topic. So I guess all of you know where Italy is, but my university, it's like here in the northwestern part of the country, close to the Alps, the, let's say, real Alps. And yeah, this is the surface of Italy, population and density, just for the context. And maybe for you to better understand the size of the country, I found this nice website where you can juxtapose two countries. And sorry for putting Italy over Michigan. You can do the opposite if you want. And if you have a look at the size, I put figures in square kilometers because we use square kilometer, but there's also square miles, probably, if you're more familiar with that. So if we look at the area of the country, and the area of land in your country, we are more or less double the size of Michigan. And in terms of the number of people, there are 6 Italian per each Michigan inhabitants. So we have this larger density compared to yours, 76 versus 200 persons per square kilometer. Fun fact, your highest mountain, it's 600-meter elevation, and well, our highest mountain, the Mont Blanc, Monte Bianco, is 4,800 meters. Well, the numbers are changing each year depending on the snowpack, so it's 4,800 something, let's say. And this is quite interesting. Over 35% of our country, Italy, is considered as a mountain area. So for us, mountain areas are those above 600-meter elevation. So this is important, and you should keep this number in your mind. So this is probably the picture of Italy that most of you have. And unluckily, I won't have the time to discuss about our great food. But, you know, this is not the all of Italy, because we in Italy also have, these kind of landscapes. So probably you don't think of Italy as a country with a lot of forests, but yeah, we do have. And we also have quite different food that is not pizza or pasta. So I hope you will come to Italy and also enjoy the mountain food. And so just to give you an idea, I would say now almost 40% of the country is covered by forests. So these numbers are from the last National Forest Inventory that was realized in 2015, but let's say the numbers were published just recently, and probably this is not the right amount. So forests are growing and growing in our country. And if you look at where forests are, so I will switch back and forth from these two slides. So we have forests over here and in Sardinia, very nice island that we do have. And we look at the geographical map of Italy, you will immediately notice where forests are. So most of our forests are located in the mountains. In the two main mountain ranges that we do have, the Alps and the Apennines or Apennines, I don't know how do you pronounce, we say Appennini, okay? So this is something that we should keep in mind. Forests in Italy are mostly located in mountain areas. So in the plain and in the hilly parts of the country, we do have mostly agriculture, crops, vineyards, this kind of stuff, while in the mountain areas, we do have forests. Concerning the ownership, 2/3 of the forests are owned by private people, and the average size of these properties is really low. Let's say less than 1 hectare. So the ownership is really fragmented all over the country, and the rest of the property is mostly owned by municipalities. If we look at the species composition, what I would like you to notice in these graphs is that the blue color is related to the alpine regions in Italy. And so in the alpine region, we mostly have pure conifers forest or mixed broadleaves and conifer forest. But the majority of forests in Italy are made up by broadleaves, almost pure broadleaf forest, mostly in the central and northern Apennine regions, in the southern Apennine regions, and in the island. Okay, this is also a fun fact, I guess. Most of our forests are managed as low forest coppices, while a little bit less than 50% is managed as a high forest. And of course, our coppice forests are made up by broadleaves because we do not have resprouting conifers in Italy, just broadleaf. Okay, this is what we do have now, and we reached these 11-something million hectares of forest, 37% of the area of this country in the last, let's say, 50, 60 years. So there was a trend of increasing numbers in the amount of forests in Italy since, I would say, the second half of last century. And so we came to this situation after a period of high pressure on forests. So we were overexploiting our forests, overgrazing. We converted most of our forests to farms, pastures. And of course, we went through not one, but 2 world wars. The second one was mostly in some mountain areas, was, how do you say, combated in some of the mountain areas that we have in Italy. And these led us with the shortage of forests and high hydrogeological instability. So we went through a period of floods, landslides, and soil erosion. So things started to change when the first national forest law was adopted in 1923. So we started to protect our forests, to restore them. And there were these huge, large-scale reforestation projects that also had a social aim, like to provide some money to poor people to survive, let's say. So, for instance, this is the Asiago Plateau in the northeastern part of Italy, and you can see these large afforestation going on and how the area looks now. So most of these are not natural forests, let's say. Yeah, actually, looking at these graphs, we notice that in Italy, there's an opposing trend as opposed to what is happening all over the world. So all over the world, we have an increasing number of people and a decreasing number in forest cover. While in Italy, we do have an increased number of people and also an increasing trend for forest cover. This is the same for most of Europe. So in the last decades, we've seen a great increase in forest cover, and this is due to several reasons. Of course, there were these afforestation and reforestation programs, but the main reason for that was land abandonment. So if we look at these animated GIF, we can see from the 1950s till the beginning of the 21st century, how, well, first urban areas started to sprawl all over Europe, but also we see an increase in forests and an increase in dense forest. So we have more dense forests with a higher growing stock compared to the past. And as I said, this is happening all over Europe. So quite recently, we were interested in this land abandonment pattern. And so we started to look at these, not only in terms of forest cover, but as we will see immediately after this slide, in terms of the effect of land abandonment and the increase of forest cover on the natural disturbance regimes. So if you look at the map, you see that in this amount of time, we had an increase of 20% of the forest cover in Italy. And this is the typical situation that you can find now in mountain areas all over particularly the Mediterranean countries. So these slopes were all cultivated. And now with the abandonment of agriculture and grazing, we have these quite dense forested slopes. So as I was mentioning, this might have an effect on the disturbance regimes that we do have. But okay, we abandoned most of the marginal lands. And of course, these marginal lands were mostly located in the upper part of the mountains. We still maintain some of the traditional landscapes, but as you might notice, it's not easy to continue cultivating this kind of land. And like here, you can see these vineyards in the Aosta Valley region, where we work a lot, and they are called like heroic wines. The wines that we can produce from those vineyards are called heroic. Well, of course they are, but they can survive because there are a lot of subsidies to maintain these cultural landscapes. Otherwise, probably we would abandon also these kind of conditions. I was saying that we recently published this paper where we reviewed the current situation in terms of land abandonment, forest cover, and the impact of natural disturbances. And again, fun fact, we found that most of the studies that were conducted on these topics were conducted in Europe, and particularly in the Mediterranean part of the continent, where there's a lot of interest in this issue of land abandonment and how it might affect disturbance regimes. Since I'm interested in wildfires, I will just focus on wildfires, but in this global review, we went through different kind of types of disturbance. Wildfires were by far the most studied disturbance in terms of the relationship between land abandonment and how it might affect its disturbance regime. So this is a general pattern that we found all over the world, and particularly in Mediterranean Europe. So this land abandonment process caused a severe alteration in fire regime and consequences on fire risk. Just to give you an idea, these are the main landscape characteristics that were modified by land abandonment. So of course, we had a huge fuel buildup, an increase in fuel connectivity. So we have a higher landscape homogeneity. Some species which are more fire prone were favored. And we also had an expansion of the wild and urban interface areas. These led to several consequences, of course, to fire risk that increased, but also fire regime alteration, particularly concerning the frequency, which increased, and the severity of these disturbances that was higher, and also other consequences, particularly related to hydrogeological instability and soil erosion. if we go quickly through some information about forest fires in Europe, of course, everybody knows that most of the fires that we do have are located in the Mediterranean part of the country. It's always on the news, Portugal burning, Spain burning, Italy burning. But if you look at the mountain range over here, the Alps, you also see some yellowish, reddish colors, average burned area per, in terms of hectares per year. So we do have fires also in the Alps. These are the 5 main countries where we have wildfires in Europe. And so Italy currently is on the podium, 3rd place. We have a lot of wildfires, but look at the average size, 12 hectares. So for you, 12 hectares might be nothing, but you have to keep in mind that our conditions are completely different from yours, particularly in terms of the topography, the density of population, and so the variability of the landscape. So we have a lot of tiny fires and some very large ones that are increasing the number here, the burnt area per year. Of course, the large ones are not in the Alps. I will spoiler myself on this. This is quite interesting. If we look at how these fires are distributed along the months over here, there's this bigger peak, of course, that is related to the summer months, but there's also a second peak, and this second peak corresponds to fires in the alpine area, in the Alps. So we mostly have fires in winter, early spring. So yes, this number is much lower than these ones, but you have to consider that this is the whole of the EU Mediterranean area, and the alpine part is quite smaller compared to the rest of it. So this is the situation in Italy. We have 2 different fire regimes. The most well-known is the summer fire regime that we do have in the Mediterranean climate part of the country. So yeah, again, most of the fire occur in summer. And in these kind of ecosystems, we do have species that have adaptation to that. So we have fire-related traits like cone serotiny, which is something you know very well. So we do have species like the Pinus pinaster or the Pinus alipensis, maritime pine and Aleppo pine. They do carry serotinous cones like your jack pine or lodgepole pine. And the share of serotinous cones that we have on these plants is strictly based on the frequency of crown fires. And of course, we've tried to reduce the number of crown fires in these ecosystems. And so sometimes also the share of serotinous cones has been reduced. And then we have this second fire regime, which is mostly found in the alpine continental climate part of the country, where this is the typical fire that you can find, low to medium intensity surface fires burning litter in broadleaf forests. So we are in winter, the leaves were shed, and what can burn is actually litter or sometimes duff. Sometimes we do have small crown fires, and these crown fires, of course, occur mostly in conifer forests that have the conditions that can propagate the fire front up to the crowns. In this kind of situation, however, we do not have species with adaptations because these fires were not enough frequent to let these ecosystem co-evolve with the fire regime and have these kind of adaptations. So they are considered fire-sensitive ecosystems, and they have a very low resilience, leading to long recovery periods. So they are like these 2 species I'm mentioning in the slide, the Scots pine and the black pine. They are, of course, pioneer species, but they are not adapted to specific stand replacing disturbances. So this was the, let's say, historical situation, winter, early spring fire season. We have the peak right now, actually, March mostly, and low to medium intensity surface fire, average size 10 hectares. So for our fire management plan, any fire bigger than 10, 15 hectares is considered like a large fire. What we are starting to see in the last decades, it's a change in this fire regime. So we are starting to having longer fire season, a higher amount of summer fires, and higher amount of lighting fires. I didn't mention, but of course, the main cause of wildfires in Italy is human activities, mostly negligence. It's not always intentional, as sometimes they say. It's mostly negligence. And we have very, very few natural fire caused by lightning up in the higher elevation pastures, typically. So what is changing particularly is the amount of stand replacing crown fires. We are seeing these kind of events, and these events are getting also bigger and of course more severe. As we all know, the main cause of these is related to climate and land use change, with some differences in time in the importance of each of these main drivers. So if we look at these picture, this is a fire that we had in the Eastern Alps in 2011. And if you notice the date, it was May, so completely outside the normal traditional fire season. And this fire actually occurred in a Scots pine plantation, one of those we were mentioning earlier. So this is an example, and this is the second example of last year. Again, July, pretty uncommon, very long drought period. And this kind of fire moving to the crowns, doing a lot of spotting. This is one side of the valley, and this is the other side. So there was this strong wind that we call Föhn. It's quite similar to the Santana wind that they have in California. And it's the main driver for these kind of crown fires to occur. And as you may notice, there were also houses involved. And so wildland-urban interface issues to deal with. And please also notice these steep, very steep slopes. That is the normal situation we have to work with. Yeah, I was mentioning that the two main, let's say, sets of variables involved in defining fire regimes all over the world are related to climate and human activities. And so any change in climate and land use might have an impact in fire regimes. So in this paper by these very well-known European scientists, they underlined really well what is also happening in Europe, in Italy. So this was made for Spain, but it's the same for Italy. So there was a change from a fuel-limited fire regime to a mostly drought-driven fire regime. So as I was mentioning, land abandonment led to these increase in fuel load, fuel buildup, and fuel connectivity. And so now we no longer have these fuel-limited situation. We have fuels everywhere. And so the limiting factor is their ability to burn. And this is conditioned, let's say, by drought periods and changes in climate. So now probably climate is the main driver for most of the changes we are seeing in fire regimes all over Mediterranean Europe. Of course, what we are expecting is a higher temperature for the future, particularly in the summer months, and a lower amount of precipitation. And these will have for sure an impact, and it's already having an impact on the fire regime characteristics all over Europe, and particularly for the Mediterranean part of the continent. What we do know is that we should expect an increase in extreme fires, and we are already seeing this increase in extreme fire and an elongated fire season. We are expecting an increase in length of the fire season of about 2 weeks per year, according to these projections. So this might be a problem for sure for our species that are sensitive to these kind of events. But there are also, like, let's say, direct impacts of climate change on the species distribution. And if we look at these two slides, just looking at the colors, you see that there's a lot of change expected. And the most of the change is involving pine and oak species, which are typically the main species we do have in areas that are prone to burning, let's say. So all these brownish color is related to more thermophilous or xerophilous oak species that are probably going to take advantage over species like Scots pine, which is the main species that is burning in northern Italy. So this is something we will go back at the end of the seminar. Again, this picture, you remember we were discussing about these out of the fire season large crown fire that we had in the northeastern part of Italy, which is the main feature that can catch your attention if you look at it. So I can pause if you answer. I will give you a hint. You know, the steep slopes. So we have a lot of forests located in the mountains, and we don't have gentle slopes, mostly steep slopes. So what might happen after this kind of disturbance? We might have problems with rockfall, for instance. And so this is a huge issue for us because this forest still is a protective forest. So since we are in the mountains, since we have these steep slopes, forests on slopes, let's say most of our forests in the mountains are classified as protective forests, which is something you might not have here, but it's quite important for us. And how to manage these forests is really important before a disturbance and particularly after a disturbance. So of course, all of our forests, they can offer an indirect protective effects against different issues, but we have a large share of these forests that are called direct protective forests because they have as their main function the protection of infrastructure and communities, houses, and so on. So most of our recent research is focused on how to manage this kind of forests after large-scale stand replacing disturbances. Probably most people, but also Italians, they do not know about the main role that these forests exert for them. So they just recognize the role of forests in protecting them when something like this happens, and it's happening a lot. So there are a lot of casualties, unluckily, when a protective forest is no longer able to protect or is not enough efficient in protecting. Or sometimes it's also a problem related to the size of these blocks, because of course, a tree cannot stop like a huge block. I guess the largest could be 5 square cubic meters. Yeah, Manu, 5 cubic meters, yeah. So just to give you an idea, in the all alpine area, almost 22% of the forests have a direct protection function only against rockfall. But then there's avalanches, landslides, and other kinds of mass movement disturbances. So they are very important features for our landscape. This protective effect is not granted forever. So if we want to keep the efficiency of these protective forests in providing these protective effects, we have to manage them. And so there's a whole part of silviculture in Italy that is specifically devoted to the management of protected forests. It's not my topic, but I know from my studies that we have to maintain an appropriate species composition, an appropriate size distribution, and appropriate structure inside this kind of forest. So they have a silviculture that it's called like minimal tending. So you have to do at least the minimum amount of interventions to keep their protective effect ongoing. Of course, when a large disturbance happens, we might have, by definition, changes in forest structure and composition, and these might have an impact on the ability of these forests to provide the protective effect. And we particularly might have, due to deadwood and their spatial pattern all over the burnt or disturbed area, we might have differences in surface roughness. Sometimes the protective effect might even increase for some of these disturbance types. So, of course, the hot topic now is how to manage this kind of protective forests when they are affected by this kind of event. This was let's say, recent large-scale wind throw that we had in 2018, particularly in the northeastern Alps, and David had the opportunity to visit some of these stands. So this is for sure a protective forest, no doubt about that. And how should we manage these forests in order to restore the forest cover in the short time or the shorter time possible, and to reinitiate or have a higher protective effect again. Another issue I want to point out is that we are starting to see more and more cascading and compound events. A disturbance followed by a second disturbance, sometimes the first one triggering the second, and this is what we call cascading events. Sometimes not. It's just because these forests might be hotspots for disturbances, several types of disturbances. Like mentioning cascading events, after the Vaya storm, the storm Vaya, of course, we had a very nice bark beetle outbreaks that is still spreading all over the region. And so we have the double impact of these two disturbances that occurred one after the other in the very short run. What might happen in a protective forest after this kind of large-scale disturbances? This is a very nice graph that was created by some Swiss colleagues who have a very large and extensive experience in managing wind throws particularly. And they were able to assess how, after a large disturbance, we might still have some residual protection offered by forests, thanks to the presence of woody debris. So actually, we have to be very careful on how to manage these woody debris. And again, keep this in mind because we will discuss about this later. But this woody debris will go through decomposition, and so their ability to protect the landscape will decrease with time. How long can be this time? It depends, of course. Sometimes also some decades, even 40 years, but for sure their protective efficiency will decrease, and we will have these window of insufficient protection until we have a new stand that will be able to offer protection again. So with management, we will have to try to reduce this window as much as possible. And this is what we are trying to work on. So after this very long introduction, I will go to what we are doing currently, or we have been doing since the last 20 plus years in the Alps in Italy concerning the management of mostly burnt area, not only burnt ones, and particularly in terms of how to manage either actively or passively these disturbed stands. This is a summary of the main objectives of our research, and by our, I mean that of the lab I'm part of. I'm leading a lab with my colleague Matteo Garbarino, and we have a bunch of very young talented people that can support us in this. So we wanted to see how different post-fire management activities can affect the recovery of these mountain forests, specifically coniferous forests, after stand replacing wildfires. And of course, we started by assessing natural regeneration dynamics, and then we wanted to see which could be the combined effect of natural disturbances plus human intervention, because each of our intervention is like a disturbance for the system, and actually to see if the current restoration practices were effective or not, and if they might have ecological consequences on the ecosystems. So we established these long-term research, as I said, 20 plus years in the Italian Alps, and we have what we call a network, the network. So these are the main study sites we've been working on. So they are spread as much as we could all over the Alpine area. Coniferous forests, I was saying, high severity stand replacing fire occurring, and more or less recent ones. Whenever you see like a yellow dot, these are sites where there's also active restoration ongoing. The approach we are using is working at different spatial scales. So from the landscape to the young, small seedling, what we call this the microsite scale. And we're using a bunch of different tools, from remote sensing to sensors in the ground and so on. The starting point of all of these was what I call the salvage logging issue. And you are, of course, familiar with that. So the removing of dead, dying, or damaged trees after disturbances. We all know it's a controversial practice, and there are trade-offs to be considered, particularly from the economical point of view and all the rest. I might anticipate that for our forests, the ones that are affected by large fires, there's no economic value for them. So salvage logging has no economical interest, let's say. And it's usually a kind of intervention which has to be subsidized. Even if the ownership is private, the state or the region, usually with EU money, will take care of the logging. And even if the material will be left to the private owners. It's only a recent thing that we could have science-based information on the impact of salvage logging. And I like to say that most of it started with the Donato controversy after the Biscuit Fire in 2002 in Oregon, yeah. And more or less in the same period, maybe a couple of years later, we started to use a similar approach to assess the impact of salvage logging in our study sites. And of course, I used to be more strict, being an ecologist, in saying I would never suggest salvage logging to be practiced, but now I'm wiser, older, and so I slightly changed my mind. I mean, I know that the impact might be different based on the different type of disturbance. So yeah, if you do have to manage a forest that was affected by a windthrow and you are waiting for bark beetle outbreaks to happen, yeah, you can use salvage logging. You have my blessing, let's say. But like in our case, for large scale, again, for Italian standards, large scale disturbances in very dry areas, this is not the best option that you can apply. So yeah, the ecological impact might depend on where we are, which species are involved, which is the disturbance, its severity, and particularly its size and spatial complexity. Now, as I said, we have a lot of information about the impact of salvage logging. We've been also part of these bunch of studies that were assessing the ecological impact of salvage logging. And we try to do like in a practical way, not only by reviewing stuff. And so we have these gradient of different interventions we are trying to compare and to assess, from doing nothing, passive restoration, to logging, deadwood, and planting, which was the most common practice in the past. And of course, there are also some intermediate intervention requiring to, for instance, to keep at least part of deadwood on the ground. This is one of our first study sites dating back to 1995. And by chance, part of this area, which was affected by a crown fire, was not, let's say, treated. They did nothing. And in the other part, they did salvage logging and they did a plantation, an experimental plantation. And it's clear that there's a huge difference between the two treatments. So this was the first time we could see with our own eyes what could happen in this kind of situation when you do nothing, and what happens when you remove all of the deadwood and plant. In this case, several broadleaves and conifer species were planted. So luckily, a few years later, this event happened. This is one of our main study sites. We call it the Nusverei wildfires. It's in the Aosta Valley. It occurred in 2005. And we had these 257 hectares burned with the crown stand replacing fire behavior. And please remember, 10-15 hectares is the size of a large fire in Italy. So 257 is large for the alpine area. So here, for the first time, we had the opportunity to collaborate with the regional administration. And we asked them not to salvage everything, because of course they did. They salvaged, I must say, 90% of the whole area. And we were able to keep a few hectares for us to play. So in some part of the area, they did nothing. And then we asked them to, let's say, manipulate deadwood. So we were trying to test intermediate human impact interventions, being like a compromise between doing nothing and applying regular salvage logging. So for instance, we felled all the dead trees and left them on the ground with a random pattern. Or, and this was, for instance, a request of the regional administration, we cut the trees with a high stump. We debranched all the trees and they moved the log in order to have a fishbone pattern on the ground to prevent soil erosion. That was the request of the regional administration. Just to give you an idea of how these costed to the general public, from 0 to 87 euros per cubic meter. And this was back in 2009. So now these numbers are probably higher. So from our first surveys, what we found is we had more natural regeneration where nothing was done. And this larger amount of natural regeneration was associated with standing and dying deadwood. So this is the first time that we could measure this kind of pattern, and we decided to go deep into this by applying different kind of approaches. So first highlight, we found higher regeneration density and diversity, both specific and structural, where we did not apply salvage logging. And so, of course, there was a critical role related to the presence of deadwood, and we wanted to understand how this was working. So since there were very few seedlings, we decided to actively search for them. And we used this case control approach. So we found a seedling and we centered this seedling in a micro plot, 20 by 20 centimeters. And in this micro site, we were measuring seedling characteristics, soil cover, and if there was a deadwood element or a rock, at least 15 centimeters high, if I'm not wrong, within 1 meter all around the seedling. And we repeated the same 1 meter eastward So this was the control. In a microsite where there was no seedling, measuring the same soil cover and presence of deadwood rocks to try to understand why we could find these seedling right here and not 1 meter eastward from the seedling. So what we did find is that we had an establishment probability up to 4 times higher if there was a deadwood element in the nearby, within 1 meter. And we repeated the same approach in all of the network that we have, and we found exactly the same patterns with the probability numbers even higher for other sites, 8 times higher probability to find a seedling next to a deadwood element. So the hypothesis was that deadwood can enhance the probability of seedlings to survive. And we call these microclimatic conditions that these deadwood elements can produce safe sites. And I'm spoiling myself, sorry. So the ecological mechanism that can explain this is called facilitation. You might probably know this. So again, the presence of deadwood, or also what are called nurse shrubs, can create better conditions for seedlings to survive. So the seed might arrive in a specific location and have a higher probability to turn into a live seedling and survive. And as I was mentioning, this can be provided by non-living objects, could be deadwood, could be also the microtopography, rocks, but also living elements like nurse shrubs. What we also found is that this spatial relationship between deadwood and seedlings was not isotropic, but it was anisotropic. So we didn't find seedlings all around the deadwood element, but we found them in specific locations. And so this is called anisotropy. And actually, we found this attraction, positive anisotropic spatial interaction between deadwood and natural regeneration with shelter objects to south, significantly increasing the probability to have regeneration. This is why we usually are in southern exposed slopes, where the, let's say, shadow that it's offered by the deadwood element might be really important in the most warm hours of the day. This kind of pattern was more important in the first harsher post-fire years, because we repeated the inventory 5 years later, and we found also a rearrangement of this anisotropic relationship. But of course, soon after the disturbance, this is when the importance of facilitation is higher. So to have a clearer idea on how this mechanism was working in our sites, we decided to measure a few variables in the soil, particularly soil temperature, also near ground solar radiation, soil moisture, and soil temperature range throughout the diurnal hours. And what we found, it's actually that where salvage logging was implemented, we had higher mean soil temperature and near ground solar radiation, lower soil moisture, and higher daily soil temperature range. So salvage areas are hotter and drier compared to the other treatments. So this was a clear explanation of how this facilitation by deadwood was working in our sites. Quite recently, we've been returning to these Nuceverai wildfire to see how regeneration dynamics were going on. And still, we do have a very limited amount of natural regeneration, less than 2,000 seedlings per hectare, 16 years after the fire, with the main species dominating the regeneration layer being European aspen, Populus tremula. And so this number is also including root suckers, because this species is a facultative sprouter, so it can have seedlings originated by seeds and also root suckers. And if we look at the target species, which is for us Scots pine, the numbers are really, really low, less than 100 seedlings per hectare 16 years after the fire. So, of course, there's something that didn't work, and we are blaming salvage logging for that. The numbers that we have tell us this. And then, of course, the regeneration dynamics are quite slow. With the elevation here is around 1,800 meters above sea level. So we are expecting low dynamics, but not that low. So we wanted to assess which were the main drivers for these post-fire recovery. And we found that the distance to seed trees was the main factor affecting recovery spatial pattern and seedling density. I didn't mention, but like fire severity in this fire was mostly homogeneous, a whole large plot of high severity all over the area, with quite few seed tree surviving or green islands. Other important drivers were relating to topography and aspect. So those areas that were in proximity to gullies were particularly important to have a higher presence of natural regeneration. And this is like a 3D model of part of the area where you can see that this is a southern exposure, and these are all the gullies I was mentioning. So on both sides of the gullies, we found a higher rate of natural regeneration. So in accordance with the local authorities, we thought it would be interesting to actively intervene if we do not consider salvage logging as an active restoration intervention. And so we did assess the probability to find natural regeneration, and we converted this probability into some kind of intervention priority. So we thought that instead of planting all over the area, it was more interesting to take advantage of natural regeneration and to go and plant where it was less probable to find natural regeneration. And so the approach we were proposing to use is called applied nucleation. So we want to plant these, let's say, small clusters of woody species, and of course try to find the best place where to place these clusters, these nuclei. And the idea is that they will go through some kind of nucleation process similar to what is happening with natural regeneration. Again, we think that these three clusters can create better conditions locally, and so have also a facilitation impact on natural seedlings that could come and establish. Let's say they could attract, for instance, also seed disperser, and so have an active intervention paired with a passive one. So this is how applied nucleation works, mimicking somehow passive restoration, fostering and increasing it compared to what is typically done. So plantation with a regular scheme, typically one species. So now this is where we are. So we've tried different scenarios for applied nucleation, and the next step is to really apply this intervention with, we have private people willing to pay for our trees to be planted. And so we are trying to move them from planting next to the main square of the village in a place where it's really needed. And so we've tried several scenarios where we plant everywhere, where we plant just in the high priority sites, to see how these might change the probability to find natural regeneration. I'm trying to move to the conclusions, but I actually don't know how much time I took. Whoa. Yeah, I'm
We start.
super. So just to summarize, this was one of our main sites. We are doing similar things all over the Alps, as I mentioned. And so distance from seed trees was by far the most important driver. So whenever we have a shortage of seed trees, it's a problem. So it's a problem, of course. And this was in the case of this fire, large high severity patch in few Green Islands. Necessity to need to intervene. We want to try this applied nucleation approach, and we were able to see how important it is to correctly select the places where you're putting your trees in order to have the right amount of trees in the right place, and also take advantage of these micro scale planning, working with facilitation mechanism, and this is called like precision restoration. So we do have precision restoration now, like precision agriculture and forestry. I was mentioning that in these specific study sites, severity was not a huge driver of natural regeneration dynamics because it was really homogeneous. And again, luckily, we had the opportunity, due to climate change, to have 9 large fires in my own region that occurred in, let's say, early fall of 2017. There was a very large drought, long and severe drought period. And so we had almost 10,000 hectares burning in 9 fires in the same period. And in this specific case, since the smoke from these fires reached the capital of the region, the regional administration was really concerned about this problem. And so we were involved in a large project about how to manage these stands that were affected by these fires. And most of these stands were protective forests. So we were in charge of assessing fire severity, because of course we knew that fire severity was a key point in defining the necessity to intervene or not. And so we, for the very first time in Italy, we applied your approach. So the normalized burn ratio, using, in this case, not Landsat, but Sentinel-2 images with a spatial resolution of 20 meters. And we coupled the remote sensing data with the composite burn index protocol, which was modified a little bit to work in our conditions. And so we produced these severity maps that were the starting point for the regional administration to assess the need to actively intervene or not in this burnt area. So, for instance, this is the largest fire, around 4,000 hectares. Again, larger and larger events that are happening in our regions. 4,000 hectares, it's quite a lot. But if you look at the distribution of fire severity classes, the high fire severity classes are not all over the burnt area, and they are somehow restricted inside. So there's a more heterogeneous distribution of severity all around the burnt area. And this was quite interesting and different from the previous fire I was mentioning, the one that was only 260 hectares, but with a whole large severity patch. And so actually, there was a lot of natural regeneration because the availability of seed trees, more or less all around, with the few exception of some larger high severity patches like these. And we again looked at the drivers of these natural regeneration dynamics. And what we found is again that the distance to seed trees was really important. And as usual, after 50 meters from the seed trees for Scots pine, you don't find a lot of regeneration. So this is the maximum distance you have to deal with. And in this specific case, fire severity was an important driver with the higher probability of finding natural regeneration in medium severity areas. So where we were opening, but not too much the canopy. And so some of the trees were surviving and could provide seed, and there was a good mineral soil where seedlings could establish. And another important driver was slope. So where you have steeper slopes, the number of seedlings is really, really low because there were a lot of erosion issues and seedlings being removed by soil erosion. So after, let's say, having studied all of these, we started to play with seedlings or seeds. And so the idea was to try to mimic the spatial pattern of natural regeneration. Where does natural regeneration establish? Close to deadwood in specific direction. And so we wanted to work with clustered afforestation and taking advantage of the presence of biological legacies, specifically deadwood. Deadwood, I didn't mention before, but can be also very important to protect our seedlings from the ungulate pressure, which might be really high in these situations, particularly in the Eastern Alps, where this work was conducted after the fire storm. So this is some kind of experiment that was done over there, where we did planted seedlings on the opposite side of sides of these deadwood elements and in a control area. And what we found again is that there was a higher probability of survival when the seedlings were planted in the shaded part of these kind of situations. And yeah, this was again proved as a facilitation mechanism working on. So now we are actively planting, and we are collaborating with freelancers and administrations that have the task to recover all of these forests. So we studied most of these mechanisms in burnt area, but we are applying them also in wind-thrown areas, for instance, like here. And this is my colleague Emanuele from the University of Padua, trying to explain to workers where to plant the seedlings, and applying this kind of clustered afforestation and trying to, let's say, modify the species composition that we had before the event, mostly Norway spruce all over the area. And now we are trying to, like, for instance, increase the number of species and increase the resilience of the system to further events. The same we are applying in these 4,000 hectare wildfire we had in Piedmont in 2017, the Susa fire I was showing you before. So since there's natural regeneration, and this natural regeneration is establishing mostly close to deadwood, we are trying to let them plant close to deadwood, and we succeeded in having at least a certain amount of deadwood not being removed with salvage logging. So of course they salvage logged because this is mostly privately owned forest. So we couldn't tell them don't salvage anything, even if the value of these Scots pine is not high, but please, at least some part of deadwood should be left on the ground. And it was not, please, it was compulsory actually. And so now we have, I was mentioning this morning with some of you, a huge amount of money from the recovery funds after the pandemic, and in forestry, and particularly in forest restoration. So they want to plant trees, of course, and sometimes it's not necessary, we all know. Here there's a large amount of natural regeneration going on. And so part of our job is explaining them how not to plant and disturb natural regeneration with their artificial seedlings. And yeah, they are trying to plant close to deadwood. This is not always happening because this is the first day they were planting. And of course, even if we try to explain them, they had to plant here. They, of course, prefer to plant in this kind of easier situation, let's say. This is the very last topic I want to point out, if you remember, we were discussing at the beginning of the seminar about the effect of climate change on species distribution. So this is part of the PhD thesis of one of our students that he's defending his thesis in a week, actually. So he's working on species distribution models. And what he was finding, what he found is that this is the area of this large fire that we had in 2017. And this is the favorability, the suitability, let's say, to make it simple, suitability for Scots pine in the area. And from like the green current condition, which is favorable condition, we are probably going towards less favorable condition for Scots pine, while this is what is going to happen to downy oak quercus pubations. So we are having better conditions for these kind of species. And so are we doing well in planting Scots pine in these areas? Probably not. Who knows? We will see in the near future. So this is also part of what we are working on. Which species should we plant? And since also the availability of seedling is really low because we close all of our nurseries. And now there's the pressure to plant, but there are not enough seedlings. Should we produce Scots pine seedlings, or should we move to other species? So, and I'm going to conclude like in 2 minutes. What we are doing right now is working with different restoration approaches. Seeding might be a big issue now because we don't have enough seedlings to plant, but maybe there are also some positive effect in seeding, directly seeding in our restoration projects. So we are involved in these trial where different oak species are tested, direct seeding towards planting. And we are also trying to directly seed Scots pine in this large fire. We are working in Piedmont region, and we are seeding these seeds in different microenvironments, open areas, under shrubs, under deadwood, to see if there's an effect of these different microsites on the survival of these seedlings. And of course, we realized that we couldn't test seeding without testing predation, because even for Scots pine, we might have very large amount of predation. And then going back to the climate change impact on species distribution, we will be working on these large trial for assisted migration of beech and silver fir, involving several research centers all over Europe, with the Swiss guys as the leader of the project and using different provenances. So, yeah, just to summarize a little bit, what we did find is that quite often doing nothing is the best option. And so compared to applying salvage logging and planting or not after salvage logging, we had a better recovery where nothing was done in these kind of situations. But yeah, of course, this was what we found and what might happen if disturbance regimes are altered more and more, and climate change is also involved. What was found was what was applied in the past certainly modified the structure of these forest ecosystems that are developing, and somehow delayed the development, very low numbers in regeneration density. But hey, we have now different opportunities and possibilities. So it's not a matter of doing or not salvage logging. There are also other options, and this is what we have been tested. So this is just a quick, let's say, checkpoint of what we found. I don't want to repeat again. Let's say the take-home message is, of course, this one. Everything is changing, so our approach to post-disturbance management, of course, also has to change. And I'm done. Hopefully, in due time, Oh, yes, I just want to acknowledge all of these guys that are part of the diffuse lab we have between the University of Torino and the University of Padua, which is represented here by Emanuele. So thanks a lot again.